Hello. There's a few things I'd like to cover in this session. I suppose the first one I want to start with is this question of social reproduction, which is what I've talked to the RS21 two times before, like once at your lovely social reproduction event and once at a session with myself and Feinon Laka, who I think was speaking from New York City. We were doing like a Skype call before. That was cool, I think. So concerning social reproduction, so just to recap for those of you who hadn't seen this before, so a lot of my own writing, a lot of my own theory, and those of my comrades is focused around this question of social reproduction as it relates to transgender communities. So the way that transgender communities provide a social basis for what then appear as transgender moments or surges in demand for services such as we've seen in the NHS, or by those less favorable to transgender people as social contagion or transgender trends or whatever other pejorative they want to use towards us. So from the outsider's view, including from reactionary perspectives, these surges or moments or contagions seem to appear as if from nowhere, or perhaps purely from ideology. So from gender or trans ideology. So they appear on the realm of ideas and then they spread into reality like an alien invasion. So instead of this, like my own social reproduction perspective and those I've been developing with a few other comrades, many of whom appear in this new collection, Transgender Marxism, which is out with Pluto next year. We've been developing this idea that transgender life is distinctive because much of our socialization, much of our enculturation, much of our formation of ourselves doesn't really come from the typical intergenerational processes which normally happen to people through the private household. Instead, it comes from specific autonomously, for the most part, organized communities which do a lot of this work, often enough collaborating between different transgender adults to sort of provide each other with the services, the resources, and the social experiences which we need to sort of emerge into this often hostile world. So this is the predictive kind of claim I'm making here, is that primarily these frameworks of social reproduction, these provisioning of services and communities and so on, are not actually going to find themselves disrupted by reactionary efforts. So right-wing forces and whatever transphobic progressives or whatever else are not really going to be able to puncture or meaningfully disrupt a lot of these activities, or at least not directly. So this is the claim that I've made. So I suppose to move on from this recap, I sort of want to talk about the recent hubbub and the recent kind of obsessional activism we've seen from various transphobic forces in the United Kingdom, because there hasn't really been anything equivalent in the rest of the parts of Europe I've sort of primarily been living in. There have been equivalent movements in Hungary, which sort of used the COVID opportunity as a chance to install various bits of anti-trans legislation. But Britain is really quite pioneering for quite a different transphobic development. So this is kind of going to draw on what everyone was introducing to us. So what I find very distinctive about what I call transphobic feminism, I call it transphobic feminism rather than TERFs or radical feminists, for reasons I'll get to. So what's distinctive about British transphobic feminism is it has this sort of orientation towards the professions, which everyone has sort of alluded to, this often psychology, but also this juridical, this legal focus, this focus on the courtroom, the interplay between the courtroom and the column, the newspaper column, that is. So this interplay between the juridical and the journalistic is what I see as very distinctive. And another thing could also be said about the presence in academia, which is especially very well entrenched. So this is kind of a UK specific feature. Places like UCL, Sussex, Cambridge, these are all institutions with transphobic feminist professors installed at them, which is very interesting. I don't think that's actually something you see, or at least the figures who are involved in other countries are not normally so laser focused on transgender issues as the professors installed in those places have become. So along the way, you sort of see this twofold approach which they've been adopted. So you have various causus belli, various focus points, legal cases such as recent Kirabel calls for information concerning the Gender Recognition Act 2 years ago, which really peaked in 2018 and ultimately resulted in nothing. These kind of legal cases are used in a kind of interlocking way for these newspaper columnists who are on side to generate transphobic verbiage. and particularly to focus around redefining terms. So, for instance, they don't like the Equality Act because the Equality Act has various protections on the basis of sex. So they're trying to redefine the word sex to say, oh, well, legal sex is not actually what sex means, even though that's what the courtroom has decided and that's what passed in. So we're going to try and redefine that word. So this is sort of the very interesting orientation they have. Now, the reason I say I don't really have a lot of interest in calling them radical feminists is increasingly what this has resulted in is a position, we can talk about this more in questions if you want, but a kind of position which is really defined by what in gender theory we'd say is a very foundationalist approach. So there's this notion that sex exists, like sex is real. There is this thing called sex, which we can identify, and sex belongs to a particular population, and we can pin down the population that has sex, and then this is the most important thing, and we have to repeat this like a mantra. So foundationalism is very striking because previously radical feminism had primarily oriented itself towards the denaturalization of existing institutions. So families, marriages, like international relations and so on, all of these were supposed to be denaturalized by this gender analysis. But now we see a sort of reversal where this transphobic feminist trend is more about a rearguard action. It's more about saying, well, we have to sort of, the notion of sex has to be protected. Otherwise, this ideological, this kind of alien force is going to give way. So there's a lot more I can say about this particular topic, but one thing which I wanted to do, one thing which I wanted to say is that, preliminary conclusion is that I think I was right. Like, I think over the past 2 years, you've seen more of a focus around these fields and these focuses which they do understand. And there's also a limit to how far the issues which are facing trans people today are caused by these transphobic movements, as noisy and as successful in their own terms as they may be. So another issue is this topic of the NHS. So NHS defunding, the overall kind of meltdown which has recently happened with the gender identity clinic system. Now, if you want my full view on this, you can read this piece which Jen Hode and I wrote together. But the TLDR of this piece is that you really can't reduce what's wrong with the gender identity clinics to austerity. So austerity is a continuation, kind of an exacerbation of the previous logic, which has existed in the clinics since their inception in the mid-1960s, the opening of the first one in London, I guess the reason that this is important to bear in mind is there's always a slight risk with these things of kind of saying, well, austerity has sort of worsened and diminished the state, and this is what's causing the problem here. But the reality is when it comes to transgender people, transgender experiences and so on, this is never going to be an adequate account. There is always a sort of antagonism and a desire for surveillance, disciplining, control, regulation, which the state interacts with, which goes a lot deeper than that. And this kind of, this sort of brings me to the next issue, which is the question of transgender activism. So something I kind of want us to talk a bit more about tonight, and maybe we can get to this in the Q&A, is that we see simultaneously in UK activism, this mixture of long-standing groups, which are sort of being invigorated by the new rising population of out trans people, and then a new orientation of liberal charities, especially Stonewall, which are sort of refocusing around transgender issues in the post-gay marriage environment as they see it. That big issue has sort of been won years ago, so now they're reorienting around, if you'll excuse the pun, now they're reorienting to trans issues. So you see this mixture of sort of long-standing, quite liberal charities like Mermaids, which has become a big focus both for transphobic feminists and supportive liberals, YouTubers, whoever else who are trying to raise money for this beleaguered group. So you see long-standing groups like this and other community groups like Gendered Intelligence kind of trying to provide services to particular people. This is also the approach taken by queer care, and then finally kind of revolutionary groups, which obviously queer care also falls into, although its focus is more kind of mutual aid based, like Edinburgh Action for Trans Health. So the kind of distinction between these groups, which I think is a very important one to draw up, is that a lot of them are sort of primarily oriented around winning on the kind of battlegrounds which I outlined. So winning on these juridical, winning on these, well, they clearly can't win on the journalistic terms, but winning on existing civic breakthroughs and trying to kind of further those ones. And I think that as the next years continue, what we're going to see is there's going to be more and more of a divide between groups of the kind, like, for instance, mermaids. So mermaids is, when I identified as a liberal group, what I mean is it's not only liberal insofar as it's collaborating and celebrating the work of the police and trying to build up ties there, it's also liberal insofar as it orients itself in a way which is minimally disruptive to the private family. So only collaborates with transgender people who have supportive parents. So this is the split between mermaids and gendered intelligence. And what we're going to see, like, increasingly as these things move along, I think we're going to see more and more of a dichotomy between groups that are minded towards that sort of approach and that sort of perspective, and those which are actually minded towards social revolution, because at a simultaneous process, you see this sort of growth of liberalized NGO, well-funded organizations, which are attempting to sort of further this, but simultaneously a swelling population of people who clearly are never going to be satisfied with the services and with the perspectives provided by them. So this sort of brings me to the final point of social revolution, and maybe this is a thing we can get back to in the Q&A. But when I'm talking about social revolution, when I'm talking about abolition, and these as sort of the core principles we should be developing and the core perspectives we need to be orienting ourselves towards, perhaps it's helpful to sort of look at other examples. So primarily when I talk about abolition, the thing that I'm most inspired by lately, I mean, I'm inspired by the whole workers and communist movement, but more recently, in recent decades, this is primarily a term which has been kept in living use by the Black feminist tradition, which has had a kind of quite a palpable impact on recent resurgences of Black struggle in the United States, like BLM, which organized the largest pro-trans protests, I think, there have been in Western history. So thinkers like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, C.C. McDonald, Angela Davis, thinkers and activists, I should say, have sort of been focused around this idea that we don't approach whatever topic it is, whether it's prisons, police forces, housework. There's been some excellent work done on all of those topics. Like, the issue with abolition is that we're not only orienting ourselves towards improving the way that these things look, we're also orienting ourselves towards them with a view that we accept the harm that's already been done to us and the social divisions and the immiseration which has already been happened. So we can't really say that we're abolitionists. We can't really say we're in the process of abolition of these features of society. And I think we can't really say we're embarking on a social revolution until we're actively identifying the harms which have been done to us and sort of trying to correct these immediately in our daily lives, and also seeing the stuff which we're already doing, the label which we're also already putting into these things, and relinking that conceptually as well. So realizing the work we've already been performing and kind of seeing it anew. So this isn't to say that I think we should be non-responsive to questions like the Gender Reform Act or Gillett competency or something, that we should take a sort of quietism to anything and a non-involvement and non-participation with anything which doesn't kind of pass muster in getting us towards the end of the nation state and the value form or whatever else. But we can't allow ourselves to be reduced to the terms which are being offered to us by this transphobic feminist movement, exactly because the understanding which they're operating from is always an impaired one. Like, they're only doing their best to thwart us and get in our way. But in reality, their efforts are not really, in reality, their efforts are already sailing past the point for the most part anyway. So that's kind of that's why I think social revolution, abolition, and these horizons are kind of an indispensable feature for our activism. Thanks a lot.